They thought the old man driving the school bus was an easy target. But when convicts hijacked the ride, they realized too late. They weren't locked in with a victim. They were locked in with a retired war machine. The morning started like any other Tuesday in rural Oregon. Gray skies, the smell of damp pine, and the relentless high-pitched chaos of Route 49. Arthur, a man whose skin looked like crumpled parchment paper, sat in the driver's seat of Bus 104. He adjusted his oversized hearing aid, causing a sharp screech of feedback that made the teenagers in the back rows groan and cover their ears. "Turn it down, Grandpa," shouted Kyle, a varsity jacket-wearing bully sitting 3 rows back. A spitball hit the back of Arthur's neck. Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He simply wiped the spot with a handkerchief, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the massive steering wheel. To the kids, those trembling hands looked like Parkinson's or fear. To a trained eye, it was something else entirely. It was the vibration of a diesel engine traveling up the arms of a man who had spent 40 years feeling the pulse of heavy machinery. It was restraint. Arthur checked the oversized rearview mirror, his eyes looking tired and watery behind thick prescription lenses. He wasn't just driving, he was scanning. He noticed the sedan trailing them in the blind spot, a beat-up black sedan with no license plates. He noticed the way the suspension rode low, indicating heavy weight in the trunk or too many passengers. But he kept his head down, playing the part of the oblivious, deaf senior citizen. He let the bus rattle over the asphalt, keeping his speed exactly at the limit, while the chaotic symphony of screaming middle schoolers drowned out the hum of the danger approaching from behind. The bus monitor, Mrs. Gable, a nervous woman who clutched her clipboard like a shield, walked up to the front. "Arthur, are you watching the road? The kids are saying you're drifting." Arthur just tapped his ear, pretending not to hear, forcing her to lean in closer. "The road, Arthur," she yelled. He nodded slowly, his expression vacant. It was the perfect camouflage. No one suspects the man they think is senile. But under that faded flannel shirt, Arthur's heart rate hadn't risen a single beat per minute. He was just waiting for the inevitable. The shift happened at the edge of the jagged tree lane, where the county road narrowed into a single lane bordered by a steep drop-off. The black sedan made its move. With a roar of a modified engine, it surged forward, cutting sharply in front of the bus and slamming on the brakes. Arthur didn't panic. While Mrs. Gable screamed and the children were thrown forward against their seats, Arthur applied the air brakes with surgical precision. Hard enough to stop without skidding, but controlled enough to keep the bus upright. The hiss of the pneumatic brakes sounded like a dying dragon. "What is happening?" Mrs. Gable shrieked, scrambling to stand up in the aisle. Before anyone could answer, the doors of the sedan flew open. 4 men stepped out. They weren't wearing masks. These were faces you saw on the 6 p.m. news, escaped convicts from the state penitentiary, wearing ill-fitting civilian clothes they'd likely stolen hours ago. They carried sawed-off shotguns and handguns. The leader, a scarred giant of a man named Voris, marched up to the bus door. He hammered on the glass with the butt of his shotgun. "Open it. Now." Mrs. Gable froze. She stood in the stairwell, paralyzed by the sight of the weapons. Her authority evaporated instantly. She looked back at Arthur, her eyes pleading for him to do something, anything. But Arthur just sat there, staring blankly ahead, his hands resting loosely on his lap. He looked confused, like he wasn't sure if this was a traffic stop or a hallucination. Voris didn't wait. He fired a round into the glass door, shattering the safety pane. He reached in, cranked the manual release, and forced the doors open. The cold forest air rushed in, bringing the scent of gunpowder and unwashed bodies. The convicts stormed the bus, shoving Mrs. Gable into a seat. "Nobody moves, nobody dies," Voris bellowed, leveling his weapon at the terrifyingly silent rows of children. "Driver, get this moving. Turn left. Into the logging trail. Now." Arthur adjusted his glasses, looking at Voris with a bewildered squint. "The route goes straight," Arthur mumbled in a shaky old man voice. Voris pressed the cold barrel of the gun against Arthur's temple. "Drive the bus, old man, or I splatter your brains over the windshield." The bus lurched forward, bouncing violently as Arthur steered it off the pavement and onto the muddy, unmaintained logging trail. The suspension groaned under the strain. The forest canopy closed in overhead, blocking out the sun and turning the interior of the bus into a gloomy, shadowy cage. Voris claimed the front, standing right beside Arthur in the stairwell, keeping his gun trained on the driver and the first few rows. 2 other convicts, Edgy and Twitchy, patrolled the aisle, while the fourth, the driver of their getaway car, had abandoned the sedan and sat in the back row to watch the rear. The atmosphere was suffocating. The children were sobbing quietly. Kyle, the bully who had been so tough 10 minutes ago, was curled into a ball, hyperventilating. Mrs. Gable was catatonic. Arthur, however, was in his element. As the bus rumbled deeper into the woods, he reached up and seemingly adjusted his hearing aid again. To Voris, it looked like the old man was just fiddling with his device. In reality, Arthur had just turned it off completely. Silence. Absolute silence. By cutting the audio, Arthur eliminated the distractions. The sobbing children, the shouting convicts, the wind. Now he felt the bus purely through vibration. He felt the traction of the rear dual tires slipping in the mud. He felt the shift of weight as the convicts walked up and down the aisle. He knew exactly where they were standing without looking, just by how the bus chassis flexed and leaned. Voris shouted a command, pointing to a fork in the road. Arthur didn't react. He couldn't hear him and he didn't care. He kept driving straight toward a denser thicket. "I said turn, you deaf bat!" Voris screamed, striking Arthur on the shoulder. Arthur looked up, feigning surprise, and pointed to the dashboard gauges. He tapped the fuel gauge and the temperature needle. He wasn't communicating fear. He was communicating logistics. He was playing the role of the incompetent obstacle, frustrating the enemy, making them angry. Angry men make mistakes. And Arthur was counting on that anger. He was buying time, analyzing the terrain and turning this yellow tube of steel into a weapon. The internal monologue of Arthur's mind was not that of a scared senior citizen. It was the cold, hard data stream of a former convoy specialist who had driven supply trucks through conflict zones in Eastern Europe. Vehicle: International IC bus. Weight: 28,000 pounds. Engine: V8 turbo diesel. Torque: high. Center of gravity: high, but stable if handled correctly. He analyzed the threats. 4 hostiles. 3 standing, 1 seated. Weapons: shotguns, close range, and 9 MMS. The convicts were getting complacent. They thought they had pacified the herd. They were ignoring the driver because he was harmless. That was their fatal error. As they navigated a particularly muddy incline, the bus engine roared, struggling for grip. Arthur saw his opportunity. Ahead, a large oak branch hung low across the path, too low for the bus to clear without damage, but perfect for a distraction. Arthur gripped the wheel. The trembling in his hands stopped completely. His knuckles went white, not from fear, but from the intensity of his grip. He glanced at the side mirror. The convict in the back, the rear guard, was leaning out the window trying to see if they were being followed. Arthur's eyes narrowed behind his thick lenses. The confused grandpa mask slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a predator's gaze. He didn't just see a school bus. He saw a kinetic projectile. He saw a battering ram. He calculated the RPMs. He needed to spike the torque. He shifted the automatic transmission into low, locking the gear. The engine whined aggressively. "What are you doing? Keep it quiet," Voris yelled, though Arthur still had his hearing aid off. Arthur ignored the vibration of the scream. He watched the hanging branch approach. He wasn't going to duck. He was going to use the environment. He waited for the precise second when the bus's momentum would carry it through the mud slick. He prepared his body, bracing his legs against the firewall. It was time to show these men that they hadn't hijacked a bus. They had boarded a war machine. The bus hit the low-hanging branch with a deafening crack. The impact shattered the destination sign above the windshield and sent a shockwave through the chassis. Simultaneously, Arthur slammed his foot onto the brake pedal. Not a full stop, but a violent pumping brake check that defied standard driving physics. The 14-ton vehicle lurched. The laws of inertia took over instantly. Voris, who was standing in the stairwell with no handhold, was launched forward. His face smashed into the dashboard with a sickening crunch, and his shotgun clattered to the floor, sliding under the driver's seat. The two convicts in the aisle tumbled over each other like bowling pins. Arthur didn't hesitate. He wasn't an old man anymore. With fluid, practiced speed, he reached for the manual door lever, a heavy steel mechanical arm used to open and close the passenger door. He didn't open it. Instead, he yanked the lever back with all his strength while Voris was trying to scramble up from the stairwell. The steel mechanism acted like a piston, catching Voris in the midsection and pinning him against the dashboard console. The leader gasped, the wind knocked out of him, trapped by the hydraulic pressure of the door mechanism. Arthur then grabbed the thermos of scalding hot black coffee he kept in the cup holder. He didn't drink it. He blindly tossed the contents over his right shoulder, aiming for the general area of the first few rows where the other thugs were recovering. Screams erupted. The hot liquid didn't neutralize them, but it created chaos. Pure, unadulterated panic. Arthur slammed his foot back on the accelerator. The bus surged forward again, throwing the villains off balance a second time. He re-engaged his hearing aid, turning the volume up to maximum. He needed to hear their positions now. "Sit down, kids." Arthur's voice boomed, deep and commanding, nothing like the frail whisper they were used to. Heads down. Now. The transformation was terrifying. The bus driver had just weaponized physics and coffee in under 3 seconds. The element of surprise is a resource that burns out quickly. Voris, bleeding from the nose and pinned by the door lever, managed to shove himself free. He was furious, his eyes wild with adrenaline and pain. Kill him. Kill the driver. Voris screamed, spitting blood onto the windshield. The two gunmen in the aisle scrambled to their feet. One of them, a wiry man with a tattoo on his neck, raised his pistol toward the driver's seat. But Arthur had anticipated this. He knew he couldn't outdraw a gunman. He had to make the platform unstable. He saw a drainage ditch coming up on the right side of the logging trail. A normal driver would avoid it. Arthur aimed for it. He yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. The bus's right side wheels dropped into the ditch, tilting the entire vehicle at a perilous 30-degree angle. The gunman with the pistol lost his footing again, his shot going wide and shattering a side window. The children screamed as the bus scraped against the earthen embankment, the metal screeching like a banshee. "You think you can take us, old man?" Voris roared, bracing himself against the grab handle near the door. He was smarter now. He was holding on. "I'm going to execute a kid for every second you keep driving." Voris lunged toward the first seat, grabbing a terrified girl by her backpack straps. This was the escalation Arthur feared. If he kept driving, the girl died. If he stopped, they all died. He needed to separate the leader from the hostage. Arthur looked into the rearview mirror. The rearguard convict in the back was trying to move forward, climbing over the tilted seats. The bus was a chaotic, tilted tunnel of violence. Arthur spotted a clearing ahead, an old lumberyard staging area. It was flat, muddy, and open. He needed speed. He gunned the engine, forcing the bus out of the ditch. The vehicle slammed back down onto all 6 wheels with a bone-jarring thud. "Let her go," Arthur said, his voice calm, cutting through the noise. "Stop the bus." Voris yelled, pointing the gun at the girl's head. "Okay," Arthur whispered. "I'll stop." Arthur looked at the speedometer. 45 miles per hour. On loose gravel and mud. "I said stop." Voris screamed. "Hold on," Arthur muttered to himself. He did not hit the brakes. Instead, Arthur grabbed the emergency brake lever, the parking brake, and simultaneously cranked the steering wheel hard to the left, locking it. He was executing a pendulum turn, a maneuver used by rally drivers and convoy specialists to flip a vehicle's direction 180 degrees in a tight space. Doing it in a sedan is difficult. Doing it in a 40-foot yellow school bus filled with children is clinically insane. The rear of the bus lost traction. The heavy tail swung out violently to the right. The entire bus began to slide sideways across the mud, drifting like a massive yellow brick. Centrifugal force became the ultimate weapon. Voris, who was holding the girl with one hand and a gun with the other, was unprepared for the lateral G-force. The back of the bus swung around with such violence that it acted like a giant baseball bat. Because Voris was standing at the front, the pivot point, he was relatively stable. But the rearguard convict, the one coming from the back of the bus, experienced the whip effect. The tail of the bus swung at high speed, slamming the rear of the vehicle into a stack of cut logs at the edge of the clearing. Boom! The impact was catastrophic for the rear of the bus. The rear emergency door was crushed inward. The rearguard convict was thrown against the back wall with the force of a car crash, instantly incapacitated. Inside the cabin, the centrifugal force ripped Voris's grip off the little girl. She slid across the seat, safely pinned against the window by the force of the turn. Voris, however, was thrown sideways into the stairwell again. The bus completed the 180-degree spin and came to a shuddering halt, facing the way they came, steam hissing from the engine. The dust cloud was blinding. The bus was stationary. The silence returned for a split second, heavy and ringing. Voris was down in the stairwell, dazed but alive. The two aisle convicts were groaning on the floor. Arthur knew this was the end of the line. The vehicle was done. It was close-quarters combat now. Arthur unbuckled his seatbelt. He didn't look like an old man anymore. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He reached under his seat, not for a gun, but for a tire iron he kept there for maintenance. Voris surged up from the stairwell, screaming in rage, raising his gun. Arthur didn't swing the tire iron like a club. He used it like a spear. He thrust it forward, jamming the end of the iron into the trigger guard of Voris's weapon just as he fired. Bang! The gun went off, but the shot went into the floor mat. The recoil, combined with Arthur's leverage on the tire iron, twisted the gun out of Voris's hand. Voris lunged at Arthur, tackling him into the driver's seat. They grappled in the confined space of the cockpit. Voris was younger, stronger, and fueled by rage. He got his hands around Arthur's throat, squeezing. "Die, you old relic!" Voris spat. Arthur's face turned red. His glasses had fallen off, but his eyes were focused. He wasn't trying to overpower the giant. He was reaching for the dashboard controls. Arthur's hand found the switch he needed, the pneumatic door control. He hit the switch to close the doors. The hydraulic doors hissed and snapped shut. But they didn't just close on air. Arthur kicked Voris backward, forcing the convict's leg out into the open stairwell just as the doors clamped shut. The doors crushed onto Voris's ankle with thousands of pounds of pressure. Voris howled in agony, his leverage gone. He was trapped. Arthur grabbed the fire extinguisher mounted by the seat, pulled the pin, and unleashed a blinding white cloud of chemical powder directly into Voris's face. Then, using the heavy metal canister, he delivered a single calculated strike to the convict's temple. Voris slumped over, unconscious. Arthur stood up, breathless, his flannel shirt torn, his chest heaving. He looked down the aisle. The other two convicts were trying to stand up, but they stopped when they saw Arthur holding the convict's shotgun, his aim steady, his face devoid of mercy. "Sit," Arthur commanded. They sat. 10 minutes later, the blue and red lights of the state police cut through the forest gloom. A SWAT team swarmed the clearing, moving with tactical precision. They expected a hostage negotiation. They expected a bloodbath. What they found was a silent yellow bus. The back door was crumpled. The tires were buried in mud. Smoke curled from the hood. The lead officer signaled for the team to breach. They pried open the front doors, which were jammed shut on Voris's leg, and stormed in. Clear! Clear! They found the children huddled in their seats, shaken but alive. They found the convicts zip-tied with their own shoelaces and duct tape from the bus emergency kit. And they found Arthur. He was sitting on the front bumper of the bus outside, wiping his glasses with that same handkerchief. He looked frail again. His hands were trembling. The police captain, a man who had known Arthur for years as "that old guy who drives Route 49, walked up to him bewildered. He looked at the wreckage, the unconscious convicts, and the impossible skid marks in the mud. "Arthur." The captain stammered. "What? How did you do this?" "That spin. That's a counter-ambush maneuver. That's military grade." Arthur put his glasses back on, magnifying his watery eyes. He tapped his hearing aid, which was letting out a high-pitched whine. Arthur said, his voice cracking. I think the road was slippery, officer. I just tried to keep the bus on the road." The SWAT leader, a veteran looking at the precise way the villains had been neutralized, didn't buy it. He looked at Arthur, really looked at him, and saw the posture, the calm, the eyes. He slowly lowered his rifle and gave the old man a subtle, respectful nod. He knew. "Sure, Arthur," the SWAT leader said softly. "Just a slippery road." The news vans arrived within the hour. Reporters were swarming, desperate for the story of the miracle on the logging trail. They wanted to interview the hero. They wanted to put Arthur's face on every screen in America. But when the cameras set up, Arthur was gone. He had given a brief statement to the police, declined a medical checkup, and simply walked away into the crowd of relieved parents. He didn't want the fame. He didn't want the questions about where a school bus driver learned to break a man's will with a door lever. As the sun set over the Oregon pines, a beat-up pickup truck drove down the highway. Arthur was behind the wheel. He turned his hearing aid off, enjoying the silence. The world is full of invisible protectors. They are the janitors, the teachers, the old men driving buses who seem too frail to hurt a fly. We mock them. We overlook them. But when the darkness comes and the monsters show their faces, we realize that the most dangerous thing in the room isn't the loud man with the gun. It's the quiet man who has been waiting for a reason to stop pretending. Drive safe, everyone. And respect the driver. You never know who is really behind the wheel.